I'm going to pick up where I left off in my very first lesson, and that is my chart number 7. I was demonstrating to you, and of course this particular lesson continues the idea of the Song of Moses in 2 Peter chapter 3. I shared with you several concepts that are found in the Song of Moses that are picked up on in 2 Peter chapter 3, not to mention the rest of the New Testament, but I'm focused particularly particularly on 2 Peter chapter 3, in order to show that the Song of Moses, being paradigmatic as it is, controlling as it is, for the narrative of eschatology in the New Testament, it will prove that the last days of 2 Peter chapter 3 were the last days of Old Covenant Israel. Now, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that if the last days mentioned by Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, are the last days of Old Covenant Israel, then we're not in the last days today, unless you want to extrapolate Israel's last days until some future end of time, which raises all sorts of theological issues within itself. But one of the things that I was sharing with you is that Peter foretold. He didn't really foretell as so much as he reminded his audience of the previous predictions of or from the Old Testament and from the apostles of Jesus, that the scoffers would come in the last days and that false prophets would come in the last days. So this chart is really a reiteration of where I left off the other day. Point number 1, Jesus said that in the last days, before the judgment of Jerusalem, Matthew 24, 10 to 12. And that period of time that he was talking about is admitted and agreed to by amillennialists and postmillennialists alike to be speaking of the last days before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and to be speaking of, in Matthew 24, 4 to 34, of the Lord's coming in AD 70. So here we have Jesus, who said that in the last days before the judgment of Israel, the last days of Israel's Old Covenant age, false prophets would rise and lead many believers astray. Peter and Jude as well, writing later in that very same generation, a very short time before AD 70, said that the predicted false prophets, the false teachers that Jesus predicted would come and predicted they would come in his generation, both Peter and Jude said they were living in that time that those false prophets, false teachers, and scoffers were already present. Now what that means is, if the false prophets and scoffers of 2 Peter chapter 3 are in fact, or chapter 2 and 3, are in fact the false prophets of the Olivet Discourse, this is virtual prima facie proof that the last days of 2 Peter chapter 3 was a referent to the last days of Old Covenant Israel, had to have been occurring in that generation and terminated in AD 70. I would suggest to you that in order to counter this, one must be able to prove that Peter had different false prophets in mind from what Jesus had in mind in Matthew 24, 10 to 12. So the question is, where's the proof of that? I've been looking for that proof for a long time and hadn't found it. It would also have to be proven that Peter was anticipating a different imminent judgment from the imminent judgment Jesus predicted in Matthew 24. Jesus predicted not only the coming of the false prophets, but he predicted the judgment of those men in that generation, Matthew 24, verse 34. Peter in 2 Peter chapter 2, when he is talking about those very false prophets, those very false teachers, he said they will bring swift judgment. That word swift, takinin, or I'll have to get with Gerald on the pronunciation. But anyway, it means imminent judgment. And by the way, that's the assessment of world-class scholars, not Don Preston's Greek. So, in order to dichotomize between 2 Peter chapter 2, 2 Peter chapter 3, and Matthew chapter 24, you would have to prove that Peter had different prophets, different false teachers, and a different imminent judgment from that foretold by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24. And yet, remember, Jesus said that judgment would be in his generation, and as just noted, Peter said the judgment was at hand. Now, I want you to notice that Peter said, remember the words that were spoken before by the holy prophets. Now, it's interesting to note and significant. Anytime in the New Testament that a New Testament writer uses the term the prophets, or simply the unorthodox word prophets, that is without the definite article, unless the context specifically identifies those prophets as New Covenant prophets, and we could even go into a caveat there, but I'm not going to. But unless the context specifically identifies those prophets as New Covenant prophets, it is invariably a reference to the Old Covenant prophets. That's pretty significant. You know, in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Ephesians chapter 4, in Ephesians chapter 4 particularly, Paul said, when he ascended up on high, he gave gifts to men and led captivity captive. And he gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets. Well, there you have the unorthodox prophets. But you see, we know this is talking about the church, not talking about Old Covenant Israel's prophets who spoke beforehand. So here we have in 2 Peter chapter 3 that Peter is alluding to the prophets. And they are not the prophets of Jesus. They are simply the prophets who have spoken before. That it's almost a guarantee that it's talking about Old Covenant prophets. I asked myself years ago, where in the Old Testament do we find the prophecy of the coming of scoffers in the last days? And I've been looking, and my phone rang one day, and it was Jack Scott. He was actually getting ready for a formal public debate. And he said, Preston, turn to Isaiah 28. I did, and we read it together, and there it was. The prophecy of the scoffers. Although the term the last days does not appear, we'll demonstrate that's what it's talking about, because it's certainly talking about the time in which the foundation stone of the Messianic temple would be laid, and it's definitely talking about the scoffers coming before the coming of the day of the Lord and denying the coming of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 28, verses 16 and following reads thusly, Therefore thus says the Lord, Behold, I lay in Zion a stone for a foundation, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not act hastily. Also I will make justice the measuring line, and righteousness the plummet. The hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will overflow the hiding place. Your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. When the overflowing scourge passes through, then you will be trampled down by it. For morning, as often as it goes out, it will take you. For morning by morning it will pass over, and by day and by night it will be a terror just to understand the report. For the bed is too short to stretch out on, and the garment or the covering is so narrow that one cannot wrap himself in it. For the Lord will rise up as at Mount Perizim. Okay. He will be angry as in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work, his awesome work, and bring to pass his unusual work or act. Now therefore, do not be scoffers, lest your bonds be made strong. For I have heard from the Lord of hosts a destruction even upon the whole earth. Now, I sure hope you heard some echoes of 2 Peter 3 and vice versa in the reading of this. Peter's prediction of the parousia with the scoffers is from the Old Testament. That's what he tells us. Well, Isaiah chapter 28 predicted the day when scoffers would come. And it would be a day like Gibeon and Perizim. Now, I have to be really honest with you. I love to study the Old Testament, and I love to know these connections. I want to know what these previous references are. So when I read this, the Lord will rise up in judgment as he did in the day of Gibeon and the day of Perizim. Well, Gibeon, the story of the Lord acting, is in Joshua chapter 10. The Amorites had come out against the Israelites, and the conflict ensued. And you remember the story probably. Joshua stood up and said, "O sun, stand still. O moon, do not give your light." And the sun stood still. And it says the Lord defeated the Amorites. The Lord defeated the Amorites. Well, at Perizim, David had been anointed king. The Philistines heard that had happened, and they thought this would be a really, really good time to strike against Israel. And so the Philistines came out against Israel and Israel against them, and David inquired of the Lord, "Should I go out?" And the Lord said, "Go out." And they whipped the Philistines. The Philistines kind of regathered their forces. They came back again, and David said to the Lord, "Should I go up? Should I rise up?" And the Lord says, "Yes, go out." David whipped them again. Philistines evidently kind of hard-headed, so they came back again. And David went to the Lord and says, "Should I go out?" And the Lord said, No, don't go out to meet them, but here's what I want you to do. Go down to Perizim. And there's a whole forest, as it were, of mulberry trees. Now, I don't know about you, but going to a grove of mulberry trees doesn't strike me as the greatest military tactic in all the world, but hey. And the Lord said, when you are there, when you hear the rustling in the tops of the mulberry trees, then know that I have gone before you, and I will give you the victory. So here's David and his army. Can't you just imagine some of the grumbling within the army? What are we doing? What are we doing? Well, the Lord told us to wait until we hear something up there. Well, what about the winds blowing? No, that's not it. That's not it. We'll hear something else. But the point of fact is, at both Gibeon and Perizim, we have a coming of the Lord. We have an action of the Lord. But you will not find a single commentary anywhere who will say the Lord came literally, visibly, bodily out of heaven. I want to see a train coming? You should. Because the Lord said in Isaiah chapter 28 that in the day of the destruction of the whole earth, he was going to come as he had come at Gibeon and Perizim. Okay? Only this time, notice that Isaiah chapter 28 says he'd come in his anger. But did you notice that he says, I'm going to do this marvelous work, but it's going to be an unusual work? Well, what did he mean by that? It's interesting to me that John Calvin recognized what he meant there. John Calvin said, this unusual work will be the fact that while at Gibeon and at Perizim the Lord came to Israel's aid, this time he's coming against Israel. And isn't that obvious in Isaiah 28? When the decree goes forth, your covenant with death will be annulled. In other words, that has to do with Israel thought they were safe. Nobody could touch them. Nobody's going to destroy them. Nobody's going to kill them. The Lord says, guess what? I'm going to annul your covenant with death. Death here is a personification. And so the Lord says, I came to your aid at Gibeon and at Perizim. But in the day in which I lay the foundation stone for the Messianic temple, I am coming. A decree has been declared for the destruction of the whole earth. I'm coming like I came at Perizim and Gibeon, only this time I'm not coming to your aid. I'm coming in judgment. So what do we find in Isaiah 28 and 2 Peter chapter 3? In Isaiah chapter 28, we have the foundation stone in verse 16. In 2 Peter chapter 2, and let's not make the mistake to think that 1 and 2 Peter talk about different things. I mean, after all, Peter said, "Brethren, this second epistle I'm writing to you, in both of which I stir up your holy minds by way of remembrance." 1 and 2 Peter talk about the same things. And in 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter talks extensively about the stone. And it's the rejected stone, but that rejected stone is the chief cornerstone of the Messianic temple. But in Isaiah chapter 28, not only do we have the promise of the foundation stone of the Messianic temple, we have the scoffers and the denial of the judgment by the scoffers. And now do not be scoffers, because I have heard a decree of the Lord. Because judgment had been decreed, judgment on the whole earth. And Peter, as I just noted and said in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 8, directly refers to Isaiah chapter 28. Peter is about the impending judgment. It is about the denial of judgment and the scoffers. It is about a judgment that had been decreed, a judgment that was treasured up before the Lord and by the Lord, and a judgment on all the earth. So in other words, what we have is Isaiah chapter 28 contains the identical motifs and identical elements of 2 Peter chapter 3, including not only the scoffers, but the destruction of creation, right? So let's take a look at the Song of Moses, Isaiah 28, 2 Peter chapter 3. In the song, Deuteronomy chapter 32, 21, the Lord said, "They have moved me to anger by their foolish idols, but I will provoke them to jealousy by those who are not a nation. I will move them to anger by a foolish nation. For a fire is kindled in my anger and shall burn to the lowest hell. It shall consume the earth with her increase, set on fire the foundations of the mountains." What do we find? We have the fiery judgment to consume the earth in Israel's last days. Remember, 3 times in either the prelude, to the song, or in the song itself, we are told this is about Israel's last days. You know what I find absolutely fascinating? The 10th century, the 11th century Hebrew scholar by the name of Rashi. Rashi is considered even to this day as the greatest Hebrew commentator in history. I mentioned several times that I have developed a real good friendship with a scholar in Israel, and we just have the greatest time talking to one another, even though we come from polar opposite perspectives. But just recently I wanted to know, as I was studying for this lesson, I wanted to know what Rashi said about Deuteronomy 32. You know what's absolutely amazing? Here is this greatest scholar in Hebrew history. When he comes to the Song of Moses, and I have it all in English, by the way, and he looks down at verses 21 and 30, where the Lord said, "Oh, that they would consider their last end." You know what he does? He basically observes the Passover. He makes no in-depth comments about it at all. None. He does talk about Israel's sin will bring God's judgment, but he doesn't develop the threefold references in 31:29, 32:20, and 32:29 and following. He just simply says, he quotes the verse and says, well, this is about Israel's last end. Well, I know that. because that's what it says. That is more than revealing to me. So here we have in the Song of Moses the prediction of the fiery judgment to consume the earth in Israel's last days. We find in Isaiah chapter 28 and 22, I have heard from the Lord of hosts a destruction determined upon the whole earth. It is a time of the tried cornerstone. It is the judgment on the whole earth. Now, I would like to interject at this point, getting ahead of myself a little bit, so that I may not have to cover it in depth and save some time later on. But the time of the laying of the foundation stone is the last days, right? Because Jesus is that tried cornerstone. And when did Jesus appear? In the last days. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1 and 2. So we have the Song of Moses talking about the destruction of the earth. We have the Isaiah 28, 22. The song is about Israel's last days and the destruction of the earth. We have Isaiah 28. Israel's last days, the destruction of the earth. We have 2 Peter 3 telling us that he is reiterating the old covenant prophets about Israel's last days, and he talks about the destruction of the earth. There is therefore a united, consistent, prophetic chain concerning the destruction and the judgment in the last days, and in those passages, the passages that Peter is drawing upon, they are undeniably about the judgment of Israel in her last days. And by the way, Isaiah 64 confirms this. This is another one of those passages that was an aha, wow, holy cow moment for me. Now, I have to tell you, Isaiah 65 and 66 have long been some of my go-to passages. I developed them extensively in my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, because that's what Peter's drawing from. But as we sometimes do, unfortunately, as Bible students, we kind of focus on a given text and we don't look at the broader context. I try to avoid that as much as possible. I try to make sure that I read before, I read after. I get as comprehensive a look as I possibly can. For some reason, I had avoided Isaiah chapter 64. Now, I wish I had a way, and I know there's a way to do it, but I'm not as tech savvy with PowerPoint as Daniel and Kyle and William or these other guys. Boy, they can do all this fancy flying in stuff, and that just distracts me. I'm going to remember you, Phil. I'm going to remember you. Okay. Yeah, no, I can't do it in Word Perfect either. So anyway, I wanted to be able to hide verse 3 down, all right? And I know Tom can show me how to do that easy enough. It's just I hadn't taken time to do it. So imagine that you can't see verse 3 and down, right? Just imagine that. Put your hand over it. Start reading with verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 64. Oh, that you would rend the heavens, that you would come down, that the mountains might shake at your presence. That's in the Septuagint. That's the Greek word prosopon, your face. And if you want to get even more technical about it, it's your nose. Oh, that the nations might shake at your presence, as fire burns brushwood, as fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, that the nations may tremble at your presence. Boy, that sounds like Isaiah wants God to come and destroy heaven and earth. Isn't that what it sounds like? Come down out of heaven, shake the earth, burn it up. Well, there's a problem with that view. When you did, past tense, when you did awesome things for which we did not look, you came down. Absolutely amazing to me. I think it was Keith Mosier in a little book that he wrote some years ago against covenant eschatology. Wasn't it Keith, William? The little pink book? Okay, as one of the instructors at the Memphis School of Preaching, do what? I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Anyway, in the book, he said one of the real problems with preterism is they talk about the coming of the Lord, the coming of the Lord. He said, but they fail to understand. There is not one place in the Old Testament when it's talking about the historical days of the Lord, they never ever say God came down. And so that means that when the New Testament says that Jesus is coming down out of heaven, that there's a difference. I'm amazed sometimes at the really awful hermeneutic that the adversaries of covenant eschatology try to employ. I'm literally amazed and saddened, I might add. So here's the claim that in the Old Testament it never speaks of the historical days of the Lord as the time when God came down. Well, let me see. Isaiah had a different attitude about that, didn't he? Oh, and by the way, all you got to do is go to Micah chapter 1. God came down out of heaven. And he trod on the tops of the mountains, and the mountains melted beneath his feet. And that was in the destruction of the 10 northern tribes at the hands of the Assyrians. So here is Isaiah saying, oh, that you would come down, that you would rend the heavens like fire burns brushwood, that the nations may know you, that they may tremble at your presence. Because when you did awesome things for which we did not look, you came down and the mountains shook at your presence. So Isaiah chapter 64 says God had come down out of heaven to shake heaven and earth in the past. And Isaiah prays that he will come that way again. Well, guess what? 2 Peter 3 is anticipating that very kind of coming. We've already seen that in Isaiah chapter 28. Isaiah 28, the scoffers would come in the last days, scoffing at the idea of the coming of the Lord as at Perizim and at Gibeon, only it would be coming against Israel. So they're scoffing at the idea of God coming against Israel. Against her, not for her. So we have in Isaiah chapter 64 the exact, precise kind of coming of the Lord in consideration. 2 Peter 3 is anticipating that very kind of coming, the coming of the Lord, to destroy heaven and earth and to bring in the new creation. Now, virtually everyone agrees that when Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 3 that he was looking for the day of the Lord to bring in the new heaven and the new earth, 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 13, after describing the day of the Lord in which the earth and the elements therein shall be burnt up, nevertheless, according to his promise, we look for a new heaven and new earth. Okay, where do we find in the Old Testament, remember, the promise of the coming of the Lord for the new heaven and the new earth? Well, we find it in Isaiah 64 through 66. Follow me, please. And like I said, this was one of those aha, wow, holy cow moments when I realized the power and the force of what Isaiah 64, 1 and 2, or 1 through 3 is saying. The scoffers of 2 Peter chapter 3, and these are the last days scoffers, remember, were denying the coming of the Lord to bring in the new creation foretold by the Old Covenant prophets. Everybody with me on this? The prophecy of the new creation, the day of the Lord to bring in the new creation, is from the Old Testament, i.e., Isaiah 64 to 66. It is an Old Testament prophecy of the day of the Lord to bring in the new creation, to reiterate. But the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 64 through 66 is the coming of the Lord of the very same identical nature as previous days of the Lord. Lord, come down. Do marvelous things, because in the past you came and you did marvelous things. Does anybody here or anybody watching believe that God had come in the past and destroyed literal, physical, material creation? No. But Isaiah said he had. Not destroyed literal creation, but he had certainly come in the past. So, the coming of the Lord of Isaiah 64 to 66 is the coming of the Lord of the same nature as previous days of the Lord. A non-physical, I don't mean that there were no physical manifestations of it, but I mean that that coming was not a literal, visible, bodily coming of the Lord. Therefore, the scoffers in 2 Peter chapter 3. Now, the scoffers are the scoffers of Isaiah 28. They are denying a coming of the Lord against Israel. The scoffers of 2 Peter chapter 3 are denying the coming of the Lord as described in Isaiah 64, but the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 64 is not a literal, visible, bodily coming of the Lord. Therefore, the scoffers were not denying the day of the Lord they were denying the day of the Lord that would be like previous days of the Lord. That's why when we read Jesus' statement in Matthew 16, 27 and 28, where Jesus said, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father. He was talking about coming as the Father had come before. Just as he said in John 5, 19 and following, henceforth the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, so that all men might honor the Son as they honor the Father. The Son can do nothing of himself, but whatsoever he sees that the Father has done, he will do likewise. How had the Son seen the Father come in judgment before? Well, let's see. He rode on a swift cloud into Egypt, Isaiah 19, by means of the Assyrians, Isaiah chapter 20. He came in flaming fire, burned up the whole earth and the whole cosmos in Isaiah chapter 34. He destroyed heaven and earth when he destroyed Babylon at the hands of the Assyrians. Isaiah 13, 1 to 15. You see the issue? So that means that in 2 Peter chapter 3, those scoffers were not denying an end-of-time, cosmos-destroying event, just as proven by Isaiah 28, Gibeon, and Perizim. What is my time? I may skip right over this. I will. I believe Paul identifies the scoffers for us in Acts chapter 13, but again, I don't have time for that. So let's look at the Song of Moses, and the motif of martyr vindication. This is the fourth point that I introduced in the very first lesson. In Deuteronomy chapter 31 and 29, the Lord said that Moses said that after his departure, Israel would become utterly corrupt in the last days. In Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 43, the Lord said that in that last days of Israel, he would avenge the blood of his saints. And again, in Israel's last days. So suffering and martyrdom, when we come to the book of Peter, is a key theme, a key motif. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 and following. Peter wrote to them and he says, you are kept by the power of God through faith for the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last days. Even though now for a little while you are in heaviness through manifold trials and temptations, that the trying of your faith, though it be much more precious than gold, might be found unto praise and to honor and glory at the revelation of our Lord Jesus Christ. Peter's talking to people who are being persecuted. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, he said, brethren, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial. And it's really unfortunate that many translations say concerning the fiery trial that is about to come. That's not correct. Do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial that is in your midst. They were being persecuted right then, right there. And in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 9, he urged them not to be soon shaken in their mind, but to take heart in the fact that they were enduring the same kind of suffering as their brethren who were experiencing that throughout the world, throughout the cosmos. That's supposed to be verse 9, not verse 10, although verse 10 is relevant. So Peter, remember, said in Acts chapter 2 that he was living in the last days. He said Christ appeared in the last days. So he was living in the last days foretold by the Old Testament prophets. Remember that, Acts chapter 3, 20 and 21. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 and following. And Peter was anticipating the imminent vindication of their suffering. Remember, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 and following. You have to suffer for a little while, Greek word oligon, until what? Until the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's the vindication of their suffering. Just like 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5, Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. Verse 7, the end of all things has drawn near. Verse 17, the appointed time for the judgment has come. What is that judgment for? The vindication of their suffering. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, while it is not overtly apparent, Peter likewise has the vindication of the martyrs in mind. But I want you to take a look here that the song in verse 43, once again, is about Israel's last days, and the Lord will avenge his saints. The day of the Lord in 2 Peter 3 is the day of the Lord for the vindication of the martyrs, as Peter said in his first letter, and he said, you greatly rejoice. That is, at the prospect of the coming of the Lord. Though now for a little while you are in manifold trials. Now, I want you to look at 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 9. This is a fascinating text. I can't even tell you the number of commentaries I've read on this, and I am somewhat perplexed by it. But in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 9, I'm perplexed by the commentators, not by what Peter said. I think I understand what Peter said. Be sober, be vigilant, he said in verse 8, because your adversary, the devil, walks around as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Him resist, being steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings that they're enduring, back to 1 Peter chapter 1, are being experienced by your brethren, or the brotherhood as some translations say, in the world. But may the God of all peace, the God of all grace, who has called us unto eternal glory by his Son Jesus Christ, after you've suffered a little while, there's that same, promise, it's not going to last long, establish, strengthen, and settle you. Now, the word experience there is from a Greek word, epitoleo. And it is used, a cognate of it is used numerous times in the New Testament, and it means to perfect, to fully accomplish, to bring to finalization. Now, since Peter, in 1 Peter, is talking about the suffering that they were enduring, and it would only be a little while, and that their suffering was part and parcel of the sufferings of Christ, that takes us back, as we'll see momentarily, to Jesus in Matthew chapter 23, and Jesus' promise that the eschatological sufferings of Christ had to be filled up in that generation. To me, it is abundantly clear that when Peter said, your same sufferings are being experienced, he's not saying, no, your brethren are not. He's not simply saying your brethren are suffering. No, he's saying their suffering with your suffering is filling up the measure of sin, or of suffering, promised by Jesus. Remember the song that Moses said in the prelude. I know that after my departure, you're going to become utterly corrupt. That's fill up the measure of sin. So the vindication of martyrs in 1 Peter is the vindication that was promised in the Old Testament. And the scoffers were, in fact, this is where I say it's not overtly, manifestly obvious in 2 Peter chapter 3, but numerous excellent scholars have seen that martyrdom and vindication is in 2 Peter chapter 3. Now, if you're familiar with a scholar by the name of Peter Leithart, Peter Leithart is in many ways, look, you read, he has a 2-volume set out on the book of Revelation. You read Revelation, his first volume on Revelation, and you're going, wow, this dude's a preterist. No doubt about it. In volume chapter 2, he tries to take back almost everything he said in volume 1. And you're going, what are you doing? But he says this, in another book, by the way, entitled The Promise of His Coming. And when you read his book, The Promise of His Coming, you're going, yep. On page 53, he cites Richard Bauckham. Richard Bauckham is a highly, highly recognized scholar in the world today. And in his commentary on Jude and 2 Peter, Bauckham says that the scoffers of 2 Peter chapter 3 were actually persecuting the church. He says, quote, the language of scoffing in 2 Peter chapter 3 carries the connotation of physical oppression. And he gives some verses. And that fits the parable of Jesus about the servant who thinks his master delayed and decides to take advantage of that situation. That's pretty astute. The scoffers were last days scoffers, and they were persecuting the church. But those last days scoffers who were present when Peter wrote would be destroyed at the coming of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3. Which is precisely what the Song of Moses said, that in the last days of Israel, God would avenge his saints. He would avenge the blood of the martyrs. That's at the day of the Lord. Now, again, Peter was living in the very time foretold by those prophets, as we have seen in Acts 2, Acts 3. And he was speaking about what the prophets said. So that means that the scoffers and their judgment at the day of the Lord is confined to the last days of Israel. And I suggest to you that Jesus' teaching on this subject is absolutely the final word. So once again, at the risk of redundancy, the song talks about Israel's last days and the blood of the martyrs being avenged. Jesus appeared when? In the last days. Oh, and he came to fulfill everything in Torah. Not during his personal ministry, but he initiated the fulfillment of all things. And Peter affirmed, once again, the last days had arrived. Okay. Jesus' teaching on the avenging of the martyrs is clear, it is emphatic, it is unambiguous, and it is explicit. Standing in the temple, Jesus said, what do you scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets, you adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, well, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, can't you just see a Pharisee going, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers. By the way, on brood of vipers, go back to Deuteronomy chapter 32, 31 and 32. This is a generation of vipers. That is the last days vipers. Serpent, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell, Gehenna? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all of the righteous blood of all of the righteous shed on the earth, from righteous Abel unto righteous Zechariah, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. You know what? One of the major objections to covenant eschatology that I've heard in one formal debate after another is, oh, no, you guys got it all wrong because the destruction of Jerusalem is a strictly localized judgment on the Jews. But the first time I ever heard that, I asked my opponent, let me ask you something. Were there any Jews around when Abel was killed? How many Jews were around when Abel was killed? And that proverbial deer in the headlight look like, well, none. And I said, well, okay. How many Jews were around in the days of Noah? Well, none. Okay. But Jesus said, all of the blood of all of the righteous, all the way back to creation. Now, folks, that's a bit more than some localized, supposedly insignificant judgment on just the Jews. All of the blood of all the righteous. Now, obviously, I don't have time to go march us through 1 Thessalonians 2, 14 to 16, or Revelation. But I hope you're familiar enough with those passages about filling up the measure of sin by killing the saints of God, being done by the Jews, and judgment coming on them in that generation. So my argument from the Song of Moses is this. The song is about Israel's last days when she would fill up the measure of her sin and God would avenge the blood of the martyrs in her last days. Point number 2, Jesus appeared in the last days. And he said that Israel would fill the measure of her sin through persecuting him, his apostles, and his prophets. And he said that judgment on her would come in that generation. And thus, here's the argument. The last days, day of the Lord. Okay? The last days, day of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3 would be to avenge the martyrs because the scoffers were persecuting the church. But the martyrs would be avenged in the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70, according to Jesus. Therefore, the last days, day of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3, was in or at the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70. See, that's kind of fancy, isn't it? There, okay. Now then, I didn't know if I'd get to this or not, but this is so cool. This is a classic example of what I've referenced before of Richard Hayes's concept of the echoes of Scripture. In Deuteronomy 32 and 22, the Lord said, "A fire is kindled in my anger, and it shall burn to the lowest hell. It shall consume the earth with her increase, and set on fire the foundations of the mountains. I will heap disasters on them. I will spend my arrows on them, for their vine is the vine of Sodom." Go to Revelation chapter 11, verse 8, and look up who Sodom was. Anyway, and of the fields of Gomorrah, their grapes are grapes of gall, their clusters are bitter. Their wine is the poison of serpents and the cruel venom of cobras. Is what? Is this judgment that I'm talking about as a result of Israel's sin in her last days? Is this not laid up in store with me? Sealed up. Now, in the Septuagint, that's the Greek word sphragus. Kind of a significant word all within itself, but nonetheless. Sealed up among my treasures. Now, the word there is a noun form, okay, from thesauri, or thesauroi. Hang on to that. Vengeance is mine and recompense. Their foot shall slip in due time in the last days. See, that's the last days when all this is going to happen. That's what he tells us repeatedly. For the day of their calamity is at hand. That is, it is at hand in the last days. And the things to come hasten upon them. When? In the last days. So God's last days judgment of Israel, of the consumption of the earth, at the time of the avenging of the blood of the martyrs, was laid up in his treasure house, in his store of treasures. Now watch. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 7 to 10, we find the prediction of the fiery destruction of, quote, heaven and earth and the elements therein. And Peter says, this same heaven and earth is kept in store. It's that word. I really have trouble pronouncing that one, I can tell you. For some reason or other, that word right there, tethisorismeno. It's the best I can do, folks. But it is a cognate of the noun form. It's a verbal form here in 2 Peter of the treasured up wrath in Deuteronomy chapter 32. One is echoing the other. Again, one's noun, one's verb. Doesn't make any difference, really. Now, what this means is, in the last days, the judgment of God's treasure would be poured out. And in 2 Peter 3, in the last days, foretold by the Old Testament, the treasured up judgment was ready to come quickly. Again, 2 Peter 2, 1-2. And 1 Peter 4:17. The appointed time for the judgment has come. So let me summarize and conclude what we have seen. And I took out a whole bunch of charts today. 2 Peter contains the key motifs from the Song of Moses. We have the key motifs of Israel's last days that are found there. We have the motif of Israel filling the measure of her sin in the last days. We have the theme of the destruction of earth in the last days. And we have the promise of the vindication of the martyrs in the last days. Pardon me. We find every one of those elements in 2 Peter chapter 3. And Peter telling us he is talking about what the Old Testament prophets predicted. So the song foretold the fulfillment of Israel's promises in the last days, and Peter was speaking of the fulfillment of Israel's promises, or last days prophecies. The Tanakh foretold the scoffers who would deny the Messiah and deny the coming judgment, and Peter cites Isaiah chapter 28 as the source of his prophecy. Jesus foretold the coming of false prophets. Peter and Jude said the predicted false prophets, the ones predicted by Jesus, by the way, were present. The song foretold the vindication of the martyrs in Israel's last days, and both of Peter's epistles foretold the vindication of the martyrs at the coming imminent parousia. The song foretold the coming judgment of fire consuming the earth, and Peter anticipated the coming judgment to consume the earth and the heavens. The song foretold the coming of the judgment that was treasured up with the Lord, and Peter anticipated the imminent coming of the treasured up judgment. And so once again, every single tenet mentioned by Peter is echoed, or is an echo of the song, demanding that unless Peter was radically redefining what the song predicted, both the time and the nature, okay? Unless Peter was radically redefining the time and the nature of what the song predicted, then since Peter is drawing on the song for his prediction of the last days and the vindication of the martyrs, the destruction of the earth, the judgment of the Lord, then that means that 2 Peter chapter 3 has nothing to do with the end of time. It has nothing to do with any proposed last day of the current age. Pardon me. Now, I don't know about you folks. Oh, I think I do a little bit. But this is some really, really good news. You know what? If you're a dispensationalist, and if you're going to watch these on the archives on YouTube later, you may be one of those people that is fearing the future. And listen, I hear from dispensationalists all the time who are scared to death of the future. Great tribulation, 3/5 of the earth destroyed. Man of sin. Yeah, that's something to be feared. And you know what? All that's supposed to take place in the last days. Folks, if we're not living in the last days, you don't have to fear the Great Tribulation. You don't have to fear a man of sin. You don't have to fear any of that stuff. Is that good news or what? Now look, I was raised as an amillennialist. And I'll only take a moment to relate an anecdote to you about how I felt about eschatology when I was a teenager. I was like most typical teenagers. I wasn't being the most faithful Christian in all the world. Won't go into detail because it's none of your business. And my conscience was eating me alive. Really was. And our house sat right here, and here's the highway on a long sweeping curve. Okay? And here's a window of my bedroom right here. And I had red curtains. And one night I was wide awake, way up, way up, way up in the night. I couldn't sleep because of my conscience, because I kept thinking, what if the Lord were to come right now? And about that time, a car comes from the west, and its headlights hit my red curtains, and my room fills with red light. That was Saturday night, morning, around 2, 3 o'clock in the morning maybe. When the invitation song was sung the next day, I was right down front. I was that scared. Now look, we ought to fear being out of harmony and out of fellowship with God. That's a horrible, horrible thing. But the anticipation and the fear of the future keeps many people paralyzed. It is not liberating. It is not liberty. It is not freedom. We are not called to a freedom to license to live any way we want. But as Daniel pointed out really, really well in his lessons, we are to live lives in full experience and manifestation of the love of God influencing the world around us. There's freedom. I hope that I've been able to convey to you a little bit through the exegesis of 2 Peter chapter 3 in light of the Song of Moses that we are not living in the last days. There is no last days of time. There is no last days in which the earth and the elements therein are going to be burnt up. That, folks, is good news. Okay, thank you very much.